If you want to read one of the best things written from a Christian point of view about plague and epidemic, you can do no worse than Martin Luther, about whom I can say many terrible things, but his stuff on plague is very good. In the 1520s, a plague was approaching. What should people do? He knew his Bible better than anyone. He knew that plague could be a judgment from God. Should Christians actually try to flee from an epidemic, or was that violating God's will? And what he said, he comes up with a very nuanced, very balanced list of what Christians should do. And first off, he says, yeah, let's understand it is a judgment of God. But that does not mean that we should not try and avoid it. We're allowed to eat and drink to avoid death. We can try and reduce or minimize the danger of plague. So what that means is we have to try and treat, help, respond to the sick. He has detailed rules about how Christians should try and treat plague orphans, those who had lost their families due to plague and epidemic. You can get this letter many, many places. It's easy to find, and it really is very well worth reading. Other reformers like Zwingli said, well, yes, okay, plague does from God, but we should try and minimize the bad conditions as far as possible. If we can do it by hygiene, if we can do it by isolation, by quarantine, great. We are using the intelligence God gave us. I can give you any number of stories about this. I'll just mention one of my absolute favorites. If you ever want a story, and who knows, this has served as many sermon texts in recent months. There is a village in England which is called Eyam, E-Y-A-M. And this is a story. It's very famous in Britain, not maybe so famous in the US, but here's the story. 1665, you had the Great Plague of London, and anything you know about the history of plague draws on that account. You know, the red crosses on the door, people going around at the end of the day shouting, "Bring out your dead," all these horrible images. But it's largely confined to London. In 1665, someone has sent a sample of clothes for sale to a small village in northern England called Eyam. And it turns out that's infected with plague, and people start dying. And the two local clergy, that is the official Anglican minister and the dissident congregational minister, who never talk to each other, get together and they say, well, there's only one thing we can do here as Christians. We have to quarantine the whole village so nobody leaves and nobody spreads it, so that it becomes a national plague. And that's what they do. And everyone in the town agrees. They have situations where they will leave money in a particular place and people will supply food. But that story is always one of the best remembered illustrations of, if you like, a Christian response to plague and epidemic. You can get many others. I should tell you, by the way, as they start off, both ministers initially think, well, maybe this doesn't apply to us. Maybe we can get our families out. And eventually the families say, nope, you're staying, we're staying. And they do. All the way through the 18th, 19th centuries, you get many instances like this where Christians secure, if you like, cultural rewards, cultural favor by their response to epidemic and plague, by not running away. In the 18th century, people are very dubious about the Catholic Church in France. You know about the attacks on the church from people like Voltaire and the Enlightenment. The great exception they always cited was in the city of Marseille, where in 1720 it had its last outbreak of plague, and where the Archbishop basically drafted everyone in the clergy and said, I don't care if it costs your lives, we have to treat people with humanity. We have to go care for the sufferers. And for many years later, people would say, well, you know, we hate the Catholic Church. It does all these dreadful things, except for Marseille, parenthesis, where they're great. And as I said, many other examples like that. You'll note, by the way, I didn't mention probably the most famous outbreak of epidemic of all, which is the Black Death of the Middle Ages. That is as close as we come to a pandemic, coming close to destroying civilization. It is an absolutely horrendous event. The impact on the churches, on clergy, is hard to judge. There are some people who say something like this: all the good clergy go out and try and help, therefore they die. Therefore, that really weakens the church in the late Middle Ages. Personally, I don't talk about it much because I don't think we can say enough about it. It's as if, you know, when you're hit by a nuclear bomb, everyone is going to die sooner or later. It's that devastating. But some of the accounts you read like a monastery where at the start of the year, someone will say, oh, you know, there's this new disease, brother so-and-so died. And then new hands will take over. And by the end of the year, it's, well, I'm the last one writing. And that's all you know. I would emphasize one thing. Don't forget how recently even the West escapes from diseases like that. In the 1840s, there are still horrible cholera epidemics. In 1918, of course, you have the great influenza epidemic, which probably killed at least 50 million people worldwide. The First World War caused 10 million combat deaths. Influenza caused upwards of 50 million. Some people say 100 million. We honestly don't know. What about religious consequences? I've actually done some work on the 1918 pandemic as it affected Africa. And that's an interesting story. What it did was to destroy the European churches, European missionaries. The European churches got absolutely no response to the influenza. They had really a couple of resources. They had aspirin and quinine, neither of which will do much good for influenza. The whites died as much as the Black Africans. And the Africans responded by setting up a series of healing churches, which at the time were tiny, and which have since gone on to have membership just in the following 100 years, running into the millions, the tens of millions. And when you write the history of African Christianity, the key turning point is 1918. How big a change is that? In 1900, there were 10 million African Christians. By 2000, there were 360 million. Today, there are 500 million. And before you're asking, that is the largest numerical change that has ever affected any religion in history. Is plague the whole story? Is healing the whole story? Of course not. But it is a very large part of the story. If you deal with African Christians and African churches, never, ever underestimate the role of healing and disease. And, you know, some Westerners will look at Africa like that and say, well, you know, it's a backward society. Don't forget how long attitudes like that last in the West. I just had one quote here. I sort of like, if I can find. Am I finding it? No, I'm not. Yes, I am. Here we go. One of the greatest Baptist preachers in the 19th century was Spurgeon, great English preacher and pastor, and arguably the best known preacher in 19th century England. And he wrote a famous essay based on his experience on the 1849 cholera epidemic, where he saw whole areas of cities being wiped out. And his response at the time was to put his foundation in faith, and he wrote a famous meditation on Psalm 91. Oh, by the way, when you read the history of Christian responses to epidemic and pandemic, I can summarize it for you quickly. It's Psalm 91, Psalm 91, Psalm 91. You're going to see it a real lot. And he actually said this, he quoted, "A German physician," he said, "was wont to speak of Psalm 91 as the best preservation in time of cholera. And in truth, it is a heavenly medicine against plague and pest. He who can live in its spirit will be fearless, even if once again London should become a Lazar house, that is, if you like, an isolation ward, and the grave be gorged with carcasses." I would toss a coin there as to whether he is saying that Psalm 91 will protect you from plague and epidemic, or you should live as if it will protect you from plague and epidemic, which is a different thing. Churches, of course, in later years have to deal with the findings of science and medicine. If you look at 1918, oh brother, you will get a sense of déjà vu when you look at how churches respond to rules that they have to wear masks, that churches have to shut. And frankly, I don't think you see anything today that you did not see at that point. Well, as you know, as everyone knew, 1918 was the last of the great pandemics. That could never happen again. Welcome to 2020. And one of the problems that Christians have and other believers have is, in a sense, they've lost so much of their experience and their knowledge. Up until 1900, responding to epidemic was something that people knew. If you're in churches, it was a basic part of what you did. We've had 100 years of amnesia, so welcome back to our real world. I've written a fair amount about what the impact of this present crisis might be, and I'm very happy to talk about that. But I'm going to say one thing very quickly, which is about the kind of I suppose scriptural resources which show up. One is Psalm 91. You cannot underestimate how often people have turned to that in terms of plague and pestilence, and above all, its message that whatever happens, God is a strong fortress. And the other passage which shows up again and again is the Epistle of James. I was like citing the Epistle of James because Luther hated it so badly he didn't want it in the Bible. And predictably, it is, of course, the most popular scripture in many of the newer and emerging churches in the world, particularly in Africa. And if you want to read the verse that has the greatest appeal worldwide to communities that find themselves in danger from plague and famine and pestilence, it goes like this. You say that tomorrow you will do this business, you'll visit this town, you'll do this thing. You fool, you don't know you'll be able to do that. Your life is a mist, your life is a vapor which rises and fades away. What you should say is, if God wills, I will do that tomorrow. And that sense of transience, of the frailty of what humans actually want, is maybe one of the great lessons that historically Christian writers and theologians have learned from epidemics. However solid the foundations of the civilization you're living in, it can fall so easily, whether it did in 1349, 1665, 1849, or 2020. And on that sunny and cheerful note, I will draw to a close and throw it open for questions. By the way, I should explain, I'm not in Waco presently. I'm in Pennsylvania, where we're suffering a dreadful heat wave where the temperature on occasion is approaching 90 degrees. Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you for rubbing that in just a little bit. Yeah, what a great insightful overview of the response. And in your Pathos blog, the one that we sent a link out to, you mentioned, I think, about 4 different current trends that are perhaps being accelerated by this current pandemic. And you talk about decline of like denominationalism, decline of institutional faith, and the economic things, and then the social capital, and several of these other trends that have been going on. And you're just basically in that article, if I'm not mistaken, talking about how this is just going to accelerate probably those trends. Do you want to say just a bit more about that?
Yeah, just a very quick summary. My argument is that after years of being very distinctive, in the last 15 years or so, the US has become much more European in a lot of its religious patterns. And we can trace that in a number of ways. The growth of the nuns, that is, the people refusing to admit any religious affiliation, doesn't necessarily mean that they don't believe in God or a supernatural power, but they will not affiliate to institutions. And those numbers have grown phenomenally. Right now, there are more nuns than there are evangelicals or Catholics than in the US. And that's based on figures from a couple of years ago. I suspect that with the impact of 2020, that's going to be seriously higher. One thing I won't talk about at great length, but you can actually tell a lot about a society from its fertility rate and birth rate. Very low fertility rates tend to be more secular. And after years of being very high fertility, just in the last decade, the US has moved to a very low fertility situation, looking much more like Denmark. And I suggest in quite a few ways, these trends signal a real Europeanization. What I say in my article is, I think the present virus crisis will accelerate these trends very, very significantly.
Thank you. We're going to throw it open and let y'all talk to Philip also.
And before anyone says, I hate Zoom conversations also.
We're used to pauses, and it's okay. Somebody's going to jump in and say something very profound any minute now.
Nothing profound from here. But do you have any recommended sources, preferably online, but recommended sources for some of the things that you were talking about in terms of the Christian response to epidemics and pandemics? And also you mentioned, I think, that there's no reason to think that churches didn't shut down during previous pandemics.
Right.
So if you could find something, or is there something online or in print that might give us a little more source material for
Sure.
that sort of statement?
What I'm going to suggest is that when this conversation ends, I will bounce a number of things to Tim, and he can circulate them. So many of the materials are just so easy to find. If you want to look up the plague of Cyprian, if you want to look up the Ian story, it's just so easy. Google is the finest form of academic cheating ever devised. But specifically the 1918 story, a lot of local papers, the Dallas papers and so on, have done things about this in recent months. You can search it into very obvious names, but like I say, I will send around a few central stories with links that you can pursue yourself. Recently, the main problem online hasn't been finding stories like this, it's been avoiding them. There've been so many. Okay, but yeah, don't let me forget that. Yeah, and again, some of the quotations that you get from Cyprian, from some of the early Christian believers, from Luther, so many of them are just, they're wonderful. They're wonderful resources, and actually they provide great texts to preach on. I forget if it's Cyprian, one of his contemporaries, but he has this great line about, a great time of plague and epidemic like this. For many people, this is, the ultimate nightmare, the ultimate dread. For us in the churches, it's the feast day. it's the happiest time because we have so much opportunity to do good. And so many good quotes there.
I was wondering, in your studies, you know, a lot of us are walking this fine line between, do we have church? Do we not have church? Are we better serving our community by not having church? Are we better serving our community by having church? And whether it's just our church people that come or the community that comes and just the community sees that we're still having church in the midst of this. And I just wondered historically, of course, I know with Zoom and computers, things are different now than it was 1918 and before.
Sure.
We can connect that way. But I just wondered if there's any thought on, you know, how do we best serve our communities in a time like this? By staying away or by meeting? Right.
You know, I'll just take this in like a really extreme form. One of the ongoing debates they have back in the 17th, 18th century. So a plague hits an area, and then people have to debate, because initially what church leaders want to do is say, oh, we must all get together and pray God that the plague turns away. So we'll have thousands of people gathered in the great pilgrimages and processions, and we'll go off and kiss the cross. And even at that time, you have doctors who are saying, please don't do this. That will spread the plague all over the place. The kind of dilemma that you're describing, if you think it's a very modern dilemma, just because you don't have Zoom and similar things in early years, there are no real ways of connecting. 1918, they certainly have debates about this, but that's the only one. That's the reason, of course, why so many churches fight so hard against church closures. In the modern context, it's almost not even a debate, because the arguments against having church open, go do something online, are so overwhelming. But that actually gets to a point I talk about in that little column I did, which is what the idea of having church on Zoom or church electronically is going to do to absolutely basic realities of the way we think. And what I call it is place, presence, physicality. The idea that you have to be at church in a building. Well, no, here I am in a comfortable chair and I got a cup of coffee and I'm watching this service. When the pandemic ends, and it will people ever be able to get to the world as it was before? How many of the changes that we're seeing now are irreversible changes? Has a new normal come into existence since March that is actually never going away? And that's an interesting one. And I honestly wonder how many churches of any kind are thinking this over, as opposed to just saying, well, you know, one day we'll be back to normal. Welcome to normal. Yeah. So, like I say, in earlier years, they really don't have too many options. Probably not until the 19th century does anyone ever say, boy, we've got an epidemic in town, we better close the churches. Only in the 20th century is that even feasible as an issue.
Along those same lines, and one of the points that you made, you talked about the aggressive decline of social capital.
Yep.
Could you briefly define social capital as you use the term, just so that I can understand the article?
Yeah. There is a well-known book that came out about 20 years ago called Bowling Alone. And it's about the idea of people belonging to these rich institutional networks that frame their life. And so, for instance, the guy takes the example of bowling leagues and fraternal societies. You know, if you look at the 1920s, 40s, 50s, whatever, people belong to all these different networks. It gives them so many resources, so much accumulated capital. And I'm trying to be very careful here about gender. Men have their networks, women have their networks. one of the things that happens in the late 20th century is that that social capital declines enormously, those social networks decline, and it leaves people much more isolated. That's got a series of political consequences, but it also has huge religious consequences. If you live in a community where people naturally join things, of course they join the local church and all its different institutions, all its clubs and programs and so on. Now imagine a world where people are much more isolated, which is one of the effects of computers and the internet, where that social capital all but vanishes. How do you mean join a church? I can get everything I want from this computer screen. So I sometimes threaten I'm going to take the very famous book Bowling Alone and do a sequel called Praying Alone, which is the story of the churches in the 21st century. And what I'm saying is the pandemic did not start that trend, anything but it's accelerating it at rocket sled pace. And I would argue that that's going to contribute enormously to secularization, not people stopping believing in God and heaven, but stopping being prepared to belong to anything. So that's sort of what I'm talking about. That Bowling Alone book made a lot of splash back in, I think it was like 2000. And everything that's happened so late has just accelerated it so fast. In your sort of your father or your grandfather's time, just think of all the networks and societies and fraternal organizations that people belonged to as a matter of course, and churches were just part of that. Now look at all those fade away, and churches maybe survived as the last network standing. So maybe what we're seeing in 2020 is the crisis of that set of institutional networks and all the social capital that it implies. That's a really major trend. And like I say, the epidemic is important there because of the rocket sled acceleration.
Yeah, it seems to me like in your various points, you've been able to articulate that the pandemic is actually bringing us both a significant threat and also a significant opportunity.
An opportunity. It's going to be very different in different countries. It's going to have a total different impact in different parts of the world. Again, like in Africa, for example. In the United States, I see some people say, this is the great time to evangelize. This is a great opportunity for the church. There'll be a great revival. I am troubled. I just do not see the opportunities in anything like the same way, because of the, I suppose, undermining of networks and religious frameworks over the last 20 or 30 years. So we're in a totally different environment than we would have been if, Billy Graham was starting preaching today. By the way, if Billy Graham was starting preaching today, what would he not have? Mass rallies, crusades, stadiums full of people, thousands of listeners. Interesting impact. Think of the greatest orator, the greatest preachers of all time, and imagine watching them on a screen as opposed to live. Imagine listening to things like this where you don't have people on either side of you or all around you, and you share a common presence, a common upsurge or participation, where it's you, your chair, and your cup of coffee. It's very hard to get stirred or galvanized or converted.
Yeah.
So it's like a let me just say this very quickly. The whole story of Christianity is a story of media revolutions. Okay, when Christianity comes in the ancient world, it becomes popular because it does away with scrolls, which people used till that point, and they invent something called the codex, or the book, that people can pick up and turn to pages, and that's a large part of the way the Bible becomes the Bible, becomes a source of faith. In the Reformation, printing reshapes faith, mass printing, mass circulation of books. Those are two media revolutions. We're now living in number three, which is the internet, which is at least equivalent to the other two. Did the pandemic start this? No. But the fact that I'm sitting here looking at you folks in a number of boxes on a screen indicates just how far the revolution has come in a very short time.
Can I have a question?
Please.
Philip, you said social capital, the influence of social capital has been declined a lot.
Yep.
And at the beginning of your presentation, you said every epidemic and plague influenced the religion severely.
Yes.
But looking back 2,000 years of church history, do we really see a big change after the epidemic or plague? I mean, social capital is still there, and even though we are losing church-related social capital, we have all kinds of internet-based social capital.
Okay.
So the basic human need is still there, and we just find other forms of accumulating social capital, I think.
Okay.
So what makes you think pessimistically about this situation in comparison with other epidemics throughout the history?
Okay. Well, as I said, let me separate a couple of things here. So I'm talking about the influence of, epidemics and pandemics and disasters, and that's one issue. Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the social capital phenomenon. I think modern societies, postmodern societies, have a situation of social capital, the way in which people interact with others, which really has no parallels in human history. The way in which people define community and exist in community is completely different in societies as they existed over the last century or so than in all previous ages, where you have a situation that is overwhelmingly urban, for example. Now, for much of that time initially, religious institutions were able to cope with those situations well by organizing their networks and so on. But so many of those networks depended on physical proximity, physical presence, physical contact in many cases. If you take that out of the situation, then you're removing those opportunities. I'll just give you an opportunity. I'll just give you an example of that. I work a lot in, say, African communities or cities where states basically do not function to provide services like welfare, education, health. Those services are all provided by religious institutions, and depending on the particular society, that either means Christian or Islamic. Largely as a result of those social services, those communal services, those networks, people adhere to those religions very faithfully. If you want to see why Islam is booming in this country, why Christianity is booming in this country, pay real attention to those kind of services. By definition, things like that have not been true in the West for a good long time. Now, could they be true again? Maybe. As I'm sure I needn't tell you, the opportunities presently for food banks, clothes banks, social services are enormous, and people remember those and will respond to those. So the opportunities are there, but I genuinely emphasize this point I'm making about the internet, electronic communications, as changing the way that people interact fundamentally. I am not normally, by the way, a pessimistic person about the church. I have written a lot of books through the years, which have spent years saying, well, you know, the secularization thing is greatly exaggerated. Just in the last 4 or 5 years, I really have come to be much more sympathetic to that view, because I'm just looking at some of the statistics that I used to cite, and they've just changed. It's not that I was wrong; I absolutely deny that, but the reality has changed. So I am concerned, and I particularly note things like this nun's figure, which is high and alarming, and I think represents a real and unprecedented change.
Well, thank you very much.
No, thank you for the question.
So what's the way forward?
I'm sorry, can I please ask you to repeat that?
So what is our way forward?
I would say a couple of things. One is to pay very serious attention to the literature that is out there on faith and the practice of faith in a, if you like, a remote environment. There's a lot of good stuff. There's a very good scholar called Heidi Campbell who is working on this. But it is to think about how a very familiar message can be presented in these kind of styles. I would also alert you to one thing, which is we talk about the 1918 pandemic. Please remember, it was actually the 1918 through 20 pandemic. It lasted 3 years. Look at our present situation. Are we looking at something that's going to run into 2022? I mean, some people would say it can't, on the basis that the economy cannot last that long without jobs, without people having livelihoods. The economic potential is disastrous. Well, that puts lots of practical needs on all churches in terms of providing things that other folks can't, in terms of food and clothing and resources and so on. It also means adapting to a new worship environment. But it also means preparing for after the pandemic, when you have all these people who have got out of the habit of church in any direct or physical sense. How do you bring them back? I don't think they're going to, if you like, suddenly flood back. What will their new expectations be? And I don't know, but if I can start a discussion about that, I would be delighted. Oh, just another thing I mentioned in that column, expect a completely different world of seminaries and colleges. A whole lot of seminaries and religious colleges were already in great economic trouble. This is going to prove the death blow to many of them. Expect a very different environment in religious and theological education. Just to give you an idea, a place that is very well funded and has a very strong institutional foundation is Baylor University, which is my employer, which I have a good knowledge of. We are presently talking about face-to-face classes, at least to some extent, in the fall. Assume that that does not happen. Assume that Baylor's tuition, which is its main financial resource, declines or collapses. Can you get away with that for a semester? Certainly. When you extend it over 1, 2, 3 semesters, what happens? It means dramatic cutbacks. I'm thinking of somebody who's spent the last few years developing a large program in terms of conferences, lectures, all of which ended last March. Will they be back in my lifetime? The largest religious academic conference is the American Academy of Religion, Society of Biblical Literature, which normally meets around Thanksgiving. Already they have canceled the event for this November as a face-to-face event. Although what they're going to try and do is hold it as an electronic remote event, but they're still going to charge the old subscription rate. Good luck on that. They're great believers in faith.
Yeah. You know, a few things have popped into my mind as you've spoken here, Philip. Thank you. One is remembering the 3 core things that Simple Church have identified as far as what a church needs to remember to keep offering or keep cultivating. Your relationship and truth, and somebody help me. I just went blank. I had them all 3. Relationship, truth, and mission. That was it. Yeah. My computer chip is getting slow. Yeah. Relationship, truth, and mission, you know, are the 3 essentials for a minimal organic kind of church expression, according to some authors. And I think those are good things to wrap our minds around about how do we do relationships now? How do we do mission now? How do we do truth now in these days going forward? The other thing I wanted to point out related to what you were saying is that many of our churches jumped quickly onto the social needs of the community by offering increasing food pantry donations, offering, you know, concern for meal delivery or help. And honestly, our federal government, the CARES Act and those things, offered unemployment boost of $600 a week for everybody that got unemployed quickly. You know, there was the $1,200 per person check that went out in the mail quickly. And, you know, so in a sense, our communities never have experienced that economic shock that is about to end in July, the end of July, unless something else happens. Where, you know, I'm thinking about my own children, grown adult children. One of them's unemployed. You know, what the social needs, I think we haven't seen the needs that we probably will be seeing in the coming weeks. You know, and the fact many of our churches jumped to try to offer and help provide practical care in the initial weeks of this, and there wasn't that much demand. It didn't soar, you know, like we thought maybe. But I'm wondering when that $600 a week stipend ends and when unemployment runs out and when, you know, those kind of things happen, we may have an opportunity to step in and help folks in a bigger way. I don't know.
You know, you talked about those 3 core elements. Can I suggest that as you look at them, it really pays to think them through in terms of demographics and age. One thing that you're getting with the present crisis is an enormous age divide, which was already there, but was so accelerated in terms of the virus, in terms of, for instance, how comfortable people are with this sort of remote existence, with ideas of place, presence, the physical. If you're under 30, you're absolutely comfortable with this. If you're over 60, you're not. Maybe when the crisis ends, the people who are over 60 are going to be coming back to church in huge numbers. Those who are under 40 are going to take a lot more convincing. That demographic gulf within the churches is going to be a huge story in the coming decade. Has that always been the case? Yes, to some extent, but now much more than ever.
Yeah. Well, Philip, I'm seeing we're about to run out of time. Wondered if there's a final thought you want to just leave us with, maybe a word of encouragement.
Yeah, I absolutely don't want to come across here as being very, very pessimistic. You know, you could argue if the church has survived the Black Death, it will survive pretty much anything. But I would suggest that we're dealing with a very different set of changes that really require some serious reimagining. And I think it's a great time for global thinking. In other words, to look at how churches are responding to these situations around the world in the places where, and there are such, the greatest problem that churches have is that they have far too many converts to deal with. And you know, I've dealt with some of them. I've heard pastors say things like, "Lord, don't send us any more converts right now. It's a different world." Think globally, and also think historically. I can guarantee that very few of the problems that churches have are totally without historical precedent. We have a long, long series of thinkers and precedents to guide us. Our kind of phrase, they're a cloud of witnesses.
Good. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Any last comments or words from any of our group here?
Well, thank you so much. The article was very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Yes,
so
I'll
much.
say thank you for your time and your work and your articles too. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you for sharing with us on today. We appreciate it.
Thank you all for the opportunity to meet you all. And like I say, I will bounce a series of links in the next 10 minutes or so. And I would point out that there will be a pop quiz, so please be very careful.
We'll be ready.
All
Yeah,
right.
thank you so much, Dr. Jenkins. And thanks, everybody. We'll be back next Monday at 9:30 and be able to pick up again. Good to
Good
see
meet you all.
everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, Tim.
Okay. Bye-bye. Lord bless you.
You too.
I am